and it's going to work very, very well. So we had great staff support on that. Unfortunately, we did not have great support from the community, the neighboring residents, which was very unfortunate. We didn't get the densities that we would have liked to have had, but again, we worked through it, and we got numbers that work very, very well, and we have no subsidies, no government subsidy at all. And we're working with Good Shepherd right now to look at the 46 units, the affordable units, for use that they may have for us. So we're very excited about that. We want to see this replicated over and over and over again. So.
Hi everyone, I'm Emma Cubitt from Envisage Architects. I have some slides to share, so let's wait for those to come up. So I'm going to talk about two different types of infill housing briefly, just as an overview, and look forward to more discussion in the Q&A part as well. Next slide. Laneway housing is a viable way to increase affordable housing in Hamilton. I did my thesis on this topic 10 years ago at the University of Waterloo, and am now considered Hamilton's expert in the topic. There's 100 kilometers of laneways in Hamilton. The city did a study 5 years ago, that identified 70 laneway houses that are currently inhabited. So you can see those on the pinpoints on the map here. Laneway houses are known by several different names: secondary suites, garage suites, converted coach house, and ADU, or accessory dwelling unit. But basically they all mean the same thing, is that they're separate house on the same lot as the primary house, and they're occupied as a rental. All the existing laneway houses in Hamilton date back many decades, as Hamilton zoning bylaws have prohibited this type of new development since the 1950s. The slide shows some examples of some of the different laneway houses that exist today in Hamilton. We're here today to talk about different solutions for affordable housing. In Hamilton, the #1 challenge with creating laneway housing has been prohibitive policies that were put in place back in the 50s that don't allow for more than one building on a lot to be inhabited. There's progress underway that Edward's going to talk about as well. And I'm really excited to hear that progress, this work that I kind of started 10 years ago, that's been a trend in many other communities, is finally going to come into fruition. The province also has created a policy in 2013 under the umbrella of their affordable housing policies that mandates municipalities to create laneway housing as a right, and also with the inclusion of reducing or waiving development fees as well. And while the Hamilton official plan does not specifically talk about laneway housing, all the principles that it talks about in the residential intensification documents kind of work right along with this idea of increasing the housing supply while maintaining the neighborhood character, aging in place, multi-generational living, and increased safety. My thesis had specific recommendations for what laneway housing could look like. You can see a few of these ideas on the screen. From design considerations for the house, the site, the relationship to neighbors, to emergency access, servicing, and setbacks. Based on my research, nearly half of all properties with laneway access would be feasible for infill development. Here's some contemporary examples from other cities across Canada. Municipalities that allow laneway housing include Vancouver, Ottawa, Victoria, Edmonton, Calgary, Regina, Saskatoon, Moncton, and there's more now as well. Here's a map from 2013, which is 5 years after laneway housing was allowed as a pilot zoning in Vancouver. Since then, over 2,000 laneway houses have been built. Last summer, Graham and I were in Vancouver for the week, and we walked around the laneways. Each laneway that we walked along had 1, 2, or 3 laneway houses being built, so it's had huge uptake and kind of become a new part of the urban fabric in that city. So Vancouver's proof that with the right policies in place, laneway housing can be done well and be very appealing for the homeowners as well as the people who are going to move into the apartments. Here in Hamilton, we have our first laneway house that was legally built in the past 60 years. Nearing the end of construction right now. It's going to be completed this summer, and it's located in the Kirkendall neighborhood. It took just about a year to go through the planning and approvals rezoning process. Because of the way that our bylaws are right now in the city, the rezoning fees and development charges were $60,000, which was a real hurdle for them, and that's one of the things we want to change with the policies changing for the city. The rezoning is supposed to be, a report's supposed to be going to council, the planning committee next month? June 19th, I didn't know that, that's great. These homeowners of the home in Kirkendall are trailblazers who took a lot of risks and incurred a lot of fees, but like pioneers, Andy and Karen are blazing a way for Hamilton's next generation of laneway house owners and dwellers. We don't need to look all the way to Vancouver for ideas. In Toronto, there's been a lot of hard work through various different advocacy groups, including a group called Lanescape. And actually, last week, they went to council once again with similar kind of proposals to what we're working on here in Hamilton, and have been asked to delay one more month, but we can learn a lot from what they're doing there. In Edmonton, they have a proactive approach where they've incentivized people to build laneway houses in exchange for commitments to affordable rents. So their program is $20,000 in grants, which is great. And a recent survey of people who own and live in laneway houses in Edmonton was created by Ashley Salvador. Since putting the new zoning in place over the past 10 years. She found some really interesting facts about people who are using these programs. Half of the dwellings that are rented by family or friends, and those rents that they're paying are half that of market rent. This shows an important strategy to create affordable housing without significant government investments. They are people willing to help each other by voluntarily creating affordability for their friends and the family and people in the community that they know that need it. This keeps more space on the government list for affordable housing for those who need it and don't have such connections. What other type of affordable housing do we know of where people are able to cut rents in half without government subsidy? So just my last few slides are about a project that I'm working on, along with Social Planning Research Council and with Good Shepherd. And while it's a different scale than these individual laneway house lots, shows another form of potential for this type of development. The site is on city-owned land that's accessed from a laneway. It's been unused for the past few decades, located right above York Boulevard in the Strathcona neighborhood. Here you can see the site from above, so it's just right in the middle of a lot. The plan is to create 26 affordable apartments for women coming out of shelter who had been in danger of homelessness. Houses are similar in scale to the other laneway houses we're talking about. They'd be 500 square feet. But in this case, they're put together and also with some common amenity space. We call this type of housing co-housing or pocket housing, where it's about kind of the community development aspects of sharing a space like this together. This is just a rendering from kind of the middle of the development, so you get a sense for what it would feel like. We're hoping that the project will be able to continue through the zoning process this year and be under development next year, later this year. All right, thanks a lot.
That was great. You know what? I'm not going to do my presentation. I'm going to go a little bit off script. Just probably get a crick in my neck turning around to look at the slides. So I'm a planner at the City of Hamilton, as my introduction stated. And I actually have a great portfolio. So much of my work is actually looking at the options for securing affordable, accessible housing in Hamilton. As Emma talked about in terms of laneway housing, next month I'm bringing forward a bylaw that will actually allow, as of right, secondary units for those properties that actually adjoin a laneway. Once again, that kind of removes some of the bureaucracy that currently one individual had to go through and spent, I think, over $150,000 in terms of studies, development charges and fees just to get a converted garage for residential use. So come June 19th, provided no appeals, there will be that ability for anybody then who adjoins a laneway to convert those existing structures or even construct new structures for the purposes of secondary rental units. I'm also involved in inclusionary zoning. As many of you may be aware, inclusionary zoning is the ability that the province has allowed municipalities to require affordable housing units as a condition of any development process. Now, this is somewhat different to Section 37, which is yet another planning tool, but inclusionary zoning actually speaks to specific affordable housing units. Section 37 is an opportunity that municipalities have in terms of leveraging development outcomes from rezoning applications. Typically through Section 37, you don't get the same kind of emphasis on affordability. Typically you'll get, parks or artwork, public spaces that are available. So we're pretty excited about inclusionary zoning. The next step for that is actually going to be a fair amount of research and community consultation. So do keep your eyes and ears open for that. And then finally, I'm actually working on a number of tower renewal projects, working with City Housing Hamilton in terms of looking at their inventory. And we're actually having a contingent from the Scandinavian countries come to Hamilton in September, and they're actually going to be presenting some design options because, as we know, Hamilton has a great inventory of older buildings, definitely in need of some capital repairs. And what we don't want to do is lose the opportunity that we have of affordable rental. Much of that stock is under pressure, not only for conversion to condominiums, but even just renovations, which then result in the owners increasing those rental costs. So, I work with economic development, and we are actually looking to incentivize those types of renovations and repairs with the sole basis of maintaining the affordability of that units. So right now, affordable housing, affordable accessible housing is a huge pressure on municipalities. But certainly we're looking to exert as much as we can through the planning process to leverage some positive outcomes, both in terms of design, but in terms of number as well as those affordable housing. And that's it, thank you.
All right, so I've been tasked with asking some questions to start off I guess a round table. We have, I think, a pretty good mix. I would be representing the community side. Sorry, I'm not speaking loud enough. We have people who build, people who design, and people who plan as part of our discussion. And I think what I'll do to start it off is just ask the really easy one, which is, if you could say there's one thing that is making it difficult to provide housing affordably, what would it be?
Are you ready? The biggest hurdle, I would say, it centers around density. We need density. And the problem is that NIMBYism is alive and well in every corner, every pocket of the city. I don't think there's an understanding that with density we can create more units. Let's look at the housing continuum for rental. If we can create more even high-end market rentable units, we're going to move people along that continuum. There are people that are paying $800-900 a month, would love to upgrade as well, move on, free up some more. If we don't start to develop at the upper end, okay, because that's the only, because I believe in non-subsidized, okay, and we have to make an environment that enables people to increase densities and be able to build at one end of the continuum, freeing up space at the other end of the continuum. So that's number one. And number two, it would be the political forces. The politicians are really looking at every vote, and the minute somebody says something about height or density, they turn the other way. My project, we started back in 2015. We talked about a 20%, we want to increase the amount of affordability. We should have had 419 units, not 219 units. Should have been 2 towers. We were reduced to just 1 tower. We were hoping to provide 100 affordable units, at least to 150. And that was knocked down simply because, again, politicians, we had not one person on the planning committee, not one councillor voted for our project. And then when it went to the committee of the whole council, we only had 2 councillors that voted in favor of our project. I think the problem is, I don't think the politicians, they're speaking out of two sides of their mouths on this issue. In our area, we had Chad Collins and Doug Connolly, because I'm in a spot where Doug Connolly is the councillor now, and Chad Collins is going to take it over with the new boundary changes. So I had to deal with two councillors tug of war in terms of this, and at the end, they asked us to eliminate the affordable component to make the project go through. And I said, who's going to tell the 5,000 or so people on this waiting list that we're going to eliminate the possibility of rental? I don't know, CMHC, I was just at a round table recently. CMHC said we've only built 160 new rental units, market rent. That's all we have, and the demand is somewhere of 800 to 1,000 market rent units. So if we're not building more units, this is where the problem is. It's a total supply issue.
Similarly, I would say that currently, specifically with laneway housing, the challenge has been not having the zoning in place to make it feasible. Hopefully that will be changing next month when it's going to the planning committee. And the other challenge has been for projects that are being subsidized by the government, it's just not having enough subsidized money to go around to these projects, because the nonprofits that I work with would be happy to build 2-3 times as much as they're currently able to, because the money just isn't there. So with the new federal announcements that have been coming out, hopefully that money will be coming this way. We just don't know the specifics yet.
I would agree with all those statements. I don't want to get too political, but certainly the commoditization of housing has really pulled away from this idea of housing as a human need and a human requirement. I think you need more of a socialist look at this in terms of how we provide housing. It's difficult, and I see that anybody who has money also has property, and they are getting secondary income through that property, and that gap between those who have and those who don't have is just increasing. So we have to go back to first principles, and before anything, I think housing is that stable start that everybody is required before they can make things happen for themselves and others. And yeah, I don't want to get too political, but I think that's one of those biggest concerns. We're not looking at this as a human need.
Okay, so I take from that we have, on the one hand, a question of how much density will communities allow, because of course if you allow more density you can have more housing. I'm not sure that brings down the cost, but it certainly increases supply. The question of zoning, and then the sustainability of funding for subsidized housing. So we built a lot of subsidized housing, as I understand it, in the 1950s, 60s, maybe even into the 70s, petered out. We've gone through a long fallow period. We now have a federal government that's thinking about putting money back into housing. And then I think Edward's point makes a lot of sense, that we've seen a acceleration of the financialization of housing as an asset rather than simply something we use. So the next question I'm going to ask, I'm wearing a community hat, so it's sort of a follow-up. I'm not principally opposed to more density, but any neighborhood association, and Beasley is more progressive than most, has been proactive in seeking out ways to expand housing diversity, introduce new forms of tenure like the land trust, where the land would be separate. I certainly have experiences elsewhere where a neighborhood association is more like a ratepayers group. But everywhere I go, people are concerned when we simply say more height and density will solve the problem, that there still has to be a way of balancing what people who live in a neighborhood think is going to enhance their neighborhood. So how do we think a little bit more nuanced about intensification so that it doesn't always come down to but I could have done X if I was allowed to build a second tower?
The thing is, most of the density has been focused downtown, which I think is not right either. Okay, I think we have to start looking at the outskirts. Look at Ancaster. Ancaster's had a height, and Edward could tell me, what was it, 3 stories? Ancaster was 3 stories high. That was the restriction. So we couldn't build anything in Ancaster more than 3 stories, which is ridiculous. How are people going to age in community? How are seniors going to age in community? Like, their kids are living in these suburban sprawl type environments. They can't even live within that environment because all the density has been put downtown, right? In a sense. So I think, number one, I think we have to start looking at density and spreading it out. Like GTA, Toronto has done a fantastic job of mixed development, and all the density is not just downtown. But I think that's number one. The other piece is, and I think it's a zoning thing, and the pocket housing, very familiar with it, worked on the pocket housing for years. I want to put pocket housing in these areas in Ancaster and development in Stony Creek on these 30-foot lots. We could build the same type of pocket housing involved in those communities, okay? And we could get more scale, because to me it's about scale. And if it's 50 square meters, there'd be no parking requirement. Seniors could be able to live with their kids, okay, in the same community. It's all about aging and community. I think that's the other piece. So I think the density burden has been really borne by the downtown. I think it has to be spread into the outskirts and be more creative.
Once again, I agree with Conrad. I like this idea of being more flexible with density. I think the problem being, though, is that the relationship with density and design hasn't been as good as it should have been throughout Hamilton's history. And people are right to be concerned with density for the sake of density. I think certainly in my role as a planner, we have to demonstrate that, the argument should shift from density to one of design. And I think great design can assure great density without any of those impacts that we have. And, being more flexible with the zoning bylaws, having a better vision. And I think you've seen that in the downtown, but to Conrad's point, I think when we look at choice in the housing market, that includes choice everywhere. And I think if you're in Ancaster, you should be able to have a rental unit. You should be able to have a small unit, or a multiple dwelling. And it's not there yet. But certainly, the zoning's one thing, but design is a huge component to teaching those people in those areas that it's okay to have that change in what they're accustomed to.
So I think following up from that, one of the things that I think is really apparent is, say 5 or 10 years ago, housing prices in Hamilton were a lot less, rents were a lot less. What we haven't seen in the last 10 years is enormous income growth. One of the things that I think is apparent when you start to look at housing and how it relates to planning and development is that the people who are already well housed have the incomes to create what is called effective demand. They can induce supply. What we're challenged with is a question of, is it an issue of how much it costs to build housing? Is it a cost of the planning process and the regulatory process? Is it land costs? Or is it a mix of those, as well as the question of how people are able to generate the kind of income to be able to afford housing that's produced? Stepping away from those, of course, who are never going to have the income to pay market rent.
I mean, that's a great question. I know personally for myself, had I not got into the property market 8 years ago, I don't think I would be able to enter into it today. So there have been significant changes. And we often, when we try and provide robust incentives, look very clearly at pro formas of development. So that takes into account development, construction costs, hard and soft costs, land costs. And 6 months is a big time. So we've gone back to the same project 6 months later and seen, 20-30% increases in terms of the construction costs. And the point you raised about income is huge. I think, too often we're talking about affordable housing, but we have a great number of citizens who can't have a true income that reflects what they do. And I think we need to have a broader discussion on, in terms of, what's a fair income, and what's a fair salary, because right now the options are becoming more and more limited based on that issue.
So just for example, in the past 10 years that I've been designing affordable housing, and using kind of growing maybe my toolbox along the way, but still using a lot of similar tactics. One of my early projects was Perkins Center, and at the time that was around, I think it was $130 a square foot for the renovation of that building to construct good quality affordable housing. And now our projects are closer to $200 a square foot, so it's a massive increase in 10 years, right? And when you break everything down to a cost per square foot, we could have created almost double the number of units for the amount of money that we have now, that 10 years ago, just because of the cost of labor and materials and kind of some of the major economic factors that we have no control over, right? That have nothing to do with our design, but everything to do with global systems, so it's a challenge.
I'm not sure how people are familiar with the Options for Homes model, but they've developed several thousand, tens of thousands of units in the GTA in Toronto, in the Distillery District, and basically it's a deferral. It's everybody getting involved. It's the city deferring development charges, parkland dedication. It's the owner of the land deferring some of the profit, and actually the developer deferring the profit completely over time. It's a market value mortgage that is placed on the property. And I'll give you an example. If all the soft costs and profit is, let's say, on a $100,000 unit, is, let's say, it's $20,000. That $20,000 is put in a second mortgage. So the person only has to get $100,000, $80,000 mortgage on the unit, 80%. It usually works 75, 85, 80. The household income, it depends. Basically, when you're dropping about 20%, so people they're conventional. So they're conventional, they don't pay CMHC fees, and all they're responsible for is 80% of that mortgage. Okay, so it depends on the size of the unit. So what it does is, it's a deferral program. We tried to bring it to Hamilton, okay? But we found the big partner, the city, would not do the deferral on the development charges. Now, the landowner said, if the city's not willing to put in as, to defer, I'm not willing to defer a part of my land cost as well. Because it only works when everybody agrees to defer about, like I said, about 20%, bringing that unit affordable. Now, what it does is it brings on units that are much, much more affordable at 20% discounted over what's happening around. That's huge. Again, the continuum, you have to look at the whole continuum. We got to look at high end all the way through, okay? And you got to look, 7 out of 10 Canadians own a home. 3 out of 10 are renting, okay? You got to look at that whole continuum from the one end of the continuum to the other. Same on the ownership piece. If we don't start to look at things like this that are not government subsidized, we're talking a deferral, okay? A deferral. So when the person sells the unit, everybody gets their money. So they can stay in there for 10 years, 20 years. When they sell the unit, and there's no rentals, you can't rent your unit either. No investors, it completely eliminates all the investors. Okay, which is a big part of the condo market here in Hamilton and Toronto. We eliminate all the investors because they say, I don't want to be involved in anything like that. They said, not even close. Okay, so if we don't start building and creating and being more flexible with things like that, because the cost, like that pocket, that laneway home, that is criminal. What those people that were put through in terms of doing something like that, and community after community in Canada are doing that, and even in Vancouver, there's the corner lot phenomenon where they're building on the corners. So they're taking those wide corner lots, setting the home back, and doing a small unit on corner lots. We have tons and tons of corner lots that you could actually, the scale of that is remarkable. What we could do here, especially in the Stony Creeks and Lancasters, where these large corner lots are just sitting there, that we could be developing as well.
So my last question will be about inclusionary zoning. Effectively, the province has just put out the regs. For people like me who are part of a neighborhood association, I was hoping that the regulations would be more prescriptive, in part because whenever you talk about affordable housing, you run into a very basic problem, which everybody wants affordable housing, but they don't want it near them. I mean, I'm exaggerating it maybe a little, there are people who do, but generally speaking, it creates a really nasty local discussion. So I had been hoping that we would see minimum requirements like a 10% or 25% where you're in a corridor for transit, which would have taken out a lot of the politicking, so to speak. So what I would like to ask, probably as the last question really, is for a comment on the new inclusionary zoning and how that might have related to monies coming from the federal government, where it would have really done some of the things we're talking about, which is not just building downtown, but also doing this elsewhere in the city. Maybe if Edward could give us a little bit of a teaser on what he's going to be doing with the regulations.
Yeah, inclusionary zoning. One of the greatest things about inclusionary zoning, is the fact that we will get truly mixed income buildings. And I think, to your point, a lot of people support affordable housing, but are a little bit concerned when it's located immediately adjacent to them, and whether they say it publicly or privately. That, I hear it. In Ancaster, they say it very differently to downtown Hamilton, but they say the same things, and you can read between the lines. So inclusionary zoning really will demonstrate, and I mean demonstrate not only to the public, but to the financial institutions, to the developers, about how successful mixed income buildings can be for the community and for the portfolio. It's, and I've done inclusionary zoning in the UK and Australia, and to be honest, inclusionary zoning typically is mid-market housing. It's not deep affordability. The attractiveness in those markets has been that the developer pays pretty much the entire bill. So there's no supplements from the city to create inclusionary zoning, but it's all at the developer's cost. And what municipalities have done in those areas is added additional supplements to make them more affordable. So you have your 10%, 15% below market, which no subsidies are provided for. with the option then for municipalities to layer on additional subsidies to bring that affordability greater. Certainly in terms of how the city is going to process inclusionary zoning, the regulations did come out. They were not prescriptive in the slightest. So they have changed and essentially said to municipalities, go figure this out. You know, you come back with a framework for inclusionary zoning, which is good and bad, because good, we get to get a really made in Hamilton approach to inclusionary zoning. The difficulty will be the political process and the community process in terms of how that will flow. So there's going to be a lot of stakeholder engagement and a lot of discussion, a lot of pro forma work done, and yeah, I think what we'll hopefully have is a responsive approach that will be implemented citywide, but obviously with potentially different provisions depending where you are in the city.
Quickly, I would have rather have seen more leadership in terms of, like this made in, and I love what you're saying, and it's a great thing to say, made in Hamilton, but unfortunately, when it comes to things like this, there should have been a dictatorship, not a democracy. And if you want to look at a great city, and I spent a quarter of my time there, it's the city of Chicago and what they've done. I've seen Cabrini Green, I live very close to it. The metamorphosis that occurred there, and that the mixed use and what they've done there is amazing. And part of it was, you wanted some more density, you wanted to push the envelope a little bit, show us what you were going to do on the affordable side. And it was, it's a business, and you got to remember, it's all about profit and what can I get out of this square piece of land. But it was dictated by the state, and it was take it or leave it. There's nothing. This is going to go on. Edward, this could go on for years. They really passed the buck. It's very, very unfortunate. I think that we have to get really more active and look at these. When we're depending on a third party funding policy, it just doesn't work. I think it's got to be something where few people have to just put their neck out, like the people that did that at home, right? Okay. Myself, put my neck out and say, look, I want to build affordable rental. And that's what I want to do. This is how I'm going to do it. The performa is going to be my own performa. But again, I need density, and I need to be able to have the units to subsidize the rest of it. So again, it's a density and a zoning issue by far.
Okay, so for the last 10 minutes, I've been told to open it up to questions from the floor. So if anyone would like to ask the panel a question, I can bring the microphone reasonably close. No takers. Okay, sure. Well, while they're thinking of their question, maybe I could ask Emma, do you design differently when you do a project for Indwell versus for a private homeowner or a private developer?
Well, the answer would be I don't know, because I have primarily focused on doing affordable housing and supported housing. So, yeah, most of my work has been with the nonprofit world, and that is my interest, because it has, it's more challenging to me to work within a tight budget and try to make beautiful spaces. And I think that we've succeeded in that by sometimes working with a smaller space, but still creating all the amenities that are important. Yeah, sure.
I'll ask it a little more directly. In the North End, the project that Indwell is doing, when it went through its design phases, one of the things that happened is it went to a passive house, which is something that is expensive up front but has long-term cost savings. Maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah. So passive house is a design strategy which is creating most energy efficient buildings in the world right now without using additional renewable energy. So it's just by having lots of insulation, triple glazed windows, and kind of smart design and the mechanical system and air tightness that we're achieving these energy efficiency levels. And all over the world, affordable housing and other nonprofits have really been the pioneers in that, because I feel like they work by a different set of values. That's just what they do. So as a result, energy or the environment will be one of those values, and that's why they'll make a commitment early on to be the pioneers for something like Passive House. And we are finding that, like with Indwell on our third project now in Woodstock, the cost just came in at $195 a square foot, which is really good. That's pretty much in line with other market projects. But for the most energy efficient building in that county. So I feel like nonprofits are my favorite kind of client, because they're willing to take that extra step and follow their values up front instead of just looking for the bottom line.
Anyone want to ask a question?
Thanks. When we were organizing this, the architects were all sitting around. Emma wasn't there. She probably could have answered this question at that time. How do you define affordability? Like, I know now I can't afford the house that I live in if I had to buy it again. Same as Edward. I don't know, maybe this is more of a question for someone like Renee from the Social Planning and Research Council, but what is it, 20% below market value? What are the different kind of definitions that you guys as experts in this area use?
The problem being that there are many definitions of affordable housing. From the planning perspective, and in general, you usually either take a reflection of what the market is or what the individual can pay. Certainly from my perspective, basing it on what the person can pay is the best way to determine affordability. So it's, I think the typical is, I'm not towards sure now, but it's 30% of their income spent on housing, and the lower percentiles is the kind of the threshold. But once again, when we talk about affordable, accessible housing, it's about choice. And so, when you look to what is affordable, I mean, someone may be able to afford a one-bedroom unit but have 4 children. That there's different understanding of what we deliver in the market and how it's affordable. So certainly my passion is creating that choice in the market. We've heard some good discussion today about innovative options to meet demand. So it goes beyond just income, it goes beyond what the market can bear. It's bringing new things to the market that can be priced differently but satisfy the requirements of those who need it.
I think we have to look at these communities and then even the project that we're doing and look at some of the tenants, the market tenants that are coming in, and we can say, how can we take some of the surplus profit and pool it, okay, to get deeper and deeper. I think that's the critical piece, and that's what Options has done. They went to their community of purchasers and said, we can either take 10% off, we can take 20% off, or we can take 25 units and take 50% off. And I think that's where it's at. And again, these communities came together and said, we'd rather see 25 families be able to afford in here at 50% of the cost that we paid. And I think that's kind of the thinking that we should be looking at. And I think as a community here, as a neighborhood, I think that's where you should be speaking to the developers and saying, look, we'd love to see this threshold brought even, look, if it's 100 families at 10% off, or if it's 25 families at 50% off, this is where we want to see this. And that's the made in Hamilton or made in neighborhood solution. We want to get deeper so we can get a deeper effect in the community as far as affordability goes. And I think that's the decision people have to make, right?
Okay, I'll do a follow-up. So can we get to 100% housed without government intervention?
The short answer.
No, and I started, housing shouldn't be looked at what it costs. You have to look at providing shelter for those that need shelter. And, there's a whole spectrum of housing, from, emergency shelter to, ownership model. But throughout that spectrum, you need to deliver those options, and from the perspective of the individual, not the market.
My answer is yes. With guaranteed income, for those who need it, then everybody could afford. It's a different way of looking at it. Right. Right. Yeah. So if that were to continue, and everyone in the community that needed it were able to access that additional income, then we wouldn't need to have these special programs.
I think yes, I've seen it with options from the ownership side. I believe it can happen in the rental side as well. I think design, like good design, but I think sometimes we have to compromise design for cost savings. We got to look at that. There's a lot of restrictions in terms of design that we could bring on. My project, I'll give you an example. We had 19-story apartment at 219 units. We widened the building. And we got 219 units and 14 stories. So again, there's an element of everybody's got to work together. You know, design, maybe compromise a little bit of some of the aesthetics that people are really keen on in terms of that to get those affordability numbers. Because now, 14 stories as opposed to 19 stories, I'll tell you, every floor is $500,000. So we just saved $2 million that we can. Actually, now $2.5 million that we can actually help with the affordable unit. So I believe, yes, I think it can occur. It can occur.
Are there any other questions from the audience before we wrap it up?
I had done some work previously with Habitat for Humanity, and I just wondered how they get their approvals to build their housing on certain lots in Hamilton, and whether it's easy or easier than you're finding, or how that all works
out. So they go through the same process as everyone else when it comes to the planning. They do have their fees waived through council motion. Council respond well to Habitat and have been working with Habitat for a number of years now. So each time they do come forward and they have the fees waived. So much so that I actually introduced a fee reduction for all non-profits delivering affordable housing. So no longer is it by council motion, it's now guaranteed through the application process. It's one of my quick wins. In terms of the site plan, they all have to go through it unless it's a single detached dwelling. So it's
The other question is, Habitat for Humanity usually builds like single-family homes, but is there any thought about joining forces and having them in multi-level dwellings?
They have, yeah.
They got them?
They've taken units. I know
Yeah.
Burlington, they've taken raw units.
Great, thank you.
And Robert Land, I was instrumental in that whole plan. I was part of the flagship, and we looked at that plan, and we actually created those lots, that whole those townhouse lots that they had with the Robert Land site as well. So they do multiple units.
Okay, I think we're at our time, and I want to say thank you again very much to our speakers, to Conrad and Emma and Edward. It's been great having you guys here. And I want to say again that this is part of an initiative that HBSA is undertaking over the next 6 months. So we will be doing at least one more public discussion, and we are aiming to have a public design component to this initiative as well. So if you want to keep up to date on this, we will be having updates about our next public discussion on the HBSA website, which is hbsarchitects.ca.com, hbsarchitects.com. Thank you again very much to our speakers. Thank you very much to Rob, and thank you very much to the Beasley Neighborhood Association for having us.
Hi everyone, the next panel is in 10 minutes. I just want to remind folks that there is food and coffee and refreshments.